Two small puppies were hugging each other, trembling in fear, just seconds away from being put down. The needle was inches away when the vet suddenly screamed, "Stop now!" But this wasn't just emotion, it was panic. She had seen something that didn't belong. In a rundown shelter where no one asks questions and animals are treated like numbers, one exhausted vet is about to break the rules. What starts as a heartbreaking moment becomes the spark that uncovers a chilling pattern. These puppies weren't just strays, they were marked, and they were never meant to make it out. As she digs deeper, she realizes she stumbled into something much bigger. A hidden network, buried records, and powerful people willing to silence anyone who gets too close. Now the clock is ticking. If she walks away, no one will ever know the truth. But if she fights back, she might not survive. Why were these puppies really marked for death? And what deadly secret is hiding behind the shelter walls? Your presence here is powerful. In a world full of noise, it's the quiet gestures of compassion that truly stand out. If your heart still makes room for kindness, you're already one of us. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as Dr. Miriam Lockhart pushed through the heavy metal doors of the North Carolina Rural Animal Shelter. The familiar antiseptic smell mixed with the unmistakable scent of too many animals in too small a space hit her nose. She adjusted the worn stethoscope around her neck, a gesture that had become more of a nervous habit than a practical need. Today was Euthanasia Day. Again. The thought sat like a stone in her stomach as she made her way down the narrow corridor lined with cages. The shelter was severely understaffed, and the kennels were packed beyond capacity. Simple math dictated what came next, a reality she had forced herself to accept over the years. "Dr. Lockhart, we're ready in room 3, called out Jamie, the veterinary technician. His voice carried the same mechanical tone they all adopted on days like this. It was easier that way, easier to pretend they were just going through the motions, following protocol, doing what needed to be done. Miriam nodded, her hazel eyes deliberately avoiding direct contact with the animals as she walked past. She had learned that trick early on. Don't look too long, don't connect, don't let them become more than statistics on a clipboard. Her fingers clutched her chart tighter, knuckles white against the paper. But then she heard it, a soft whimper that cut through her carefully constructed walls. Despite herself, she turned toward the sound. In the corner cage, 2 puppies huddled together, their bodies intertwined so completely it was hard to tell where one ended and the other began. They were mutts, maybe 3 months old with matching brown and white patches. What struck Miriam wasn't their appearance, it was their embrace. The way they clung to each other, trembling but unified, facing their fate together. "These 2 are next," Jamie said, reaching for the cage door. "They came in as strays last week, no chips, no collars, and we're well over capacity." Miriam stood frozen, watching as Jamie separated the puppies. They struggled to maintain their grip on each other, letting out small, desperate cries that echoed off the concrete walls. Something about their behavior nagged at her consciousness, triggering a memory she couldn't quite grasp. As Jamie placed the first puppy on the examination table, Miriam found herself moving closer, her professional detachment cracking. The pup's fur was matted but clean, too clean for actual strays. And there, just behind its ear, her heart stopped. The scar was small, precise, and all too familiar. She quickly checked the second puppy. The same mark in exactly the same place. Memories flooded back, similar scars on other animals, a private clinic she'd worked at years ago, whispered conversations about research protocols that didn't quite add up. The realization hit her like a physical blow. These weren't strays. These were lab animals, escapees. Jamie was already filling the syringe with the euthanasia solution, his movements practiced and efficient. The first puppy lay still on the table, resigned to its fate, while its sibling whimpered from the holding cage. "Stop now!" The words burst from Miriam's throat before she could stop them. Her shout echoed through the room, causing Jamie to jump, nearly dropping the syringe. Dr. Lockhart? Jamie stared at her, confusion written across his face. Is something wrong? Miriam's hands were shaking as she gently lifted the puppy from the table, examining the scar more closely. We can't euthanize these dogs, she said, her voice hoarse but firm. These marks, they're not random injuries. They're identification tags, surgical ones. These puppies, they're evidence. The weight of what she was saying, what it might mean, settled over the room. Jamie set down the syringe, looking uncertain. Evidence of what? Miriam cradled the puppy closer, feeling its rapid heartbeat against her chest. Its sibling was still crying softly from the cage, reaching paws through the bars toward its companion. I'm not entirely sure yet, she admitted, but I've seen these marks before, at a private clinic I used to work for. They're not supposed to be here. These puppies were never strays. They were part of something else, something that needs to be investigated. She took a deep breath, knowing that what she was about to do could change everything. Again. The last time she'd spoken up about suspicious practices, it had cost her her reputation, her career stability, nearly everything. But looking down at the trembling puppy in her arms, at its sibling reaching desperately through the cage bars, she knew she couldn't stay silent. Not this time. Not again. Miriam's hands trembled as she lifted each puppy onto the examination table. The overhead light revealed what she'd feared. The scars weren't random marks. They were precise, surgical incisions, placed exactly where illegal microchips would be inserted. She'd seen identical scars 5 years ago at the private clinic that had cost her everything. Look at these, she murmured, gently parting the fur around the marks. The puppies, no longer separated, pressed against each other for comfort. These aren't accident scars or street injuries. These are deliberate surgical cuts. Jamie hovered nearby, uncertainty written across his face. Should I get Mr. Henders? No, I'll talk to him myself. Miriam's voice was firm, despite her racing heart. She needed to document everything first. Pulling out her phone, she carefully photographed the scars, making sure to capture their precise placement and similarity. The sound of heavy footsteps in the hallway made her look up. Carl Henders burst through the door, his face already flushed with irritation. His button-down shirt was stained with coffee, and sweat beaded on his forehead despite the room's chill. What's the holdup, Dr. Lockhart? His voice carried an edge of impatience. We have quotas to meet. The shelter's overcrowded as it is. Miriam straightened her back, meeting his gaze. These puppies can't be euthanized, Mr. Henders. They're evidence of illegal operations. Look at these surgical marks. They're identical to ones I've documented before in cases of unauthorized experimentation. Carl's face darkened. Evidence? These are strays, Dr. Lockhart, and they're taking up space we don't have. Either do your job or what? Miriam challenged, stepping between him and the puppies. You'll suspend me for following proper investigative protocol when abuse is suspected? That's exactly what I'll do. Carl's voice rose, making the puppies cower. This shelter runs on strict guidelines. We don't have time for conspiracy theories about surgical scars. Either proceed with the scheduled euthanasia or consider yourself suspended without pay. The threat hung in the air, heavy and familiar. Miriam had heard similar words before, when she'd tried to expose the private clinic's illegal practices. But something about Carl's urgency, his aggressive insistence on following protocol now, when he usually bent rules freely, set off warning bells. I'll need that suspension in writing, Miriam said quietly, gathering the puppies in her arms. And I'm taking these two to quarantine pending investigation. That is still shelter protocol, isn't it? Carl's face had turned an alarming shade of red. You'll regret this, Lockhart. I promise you that. He stormed out, slamming the door behind him. Miriam's legs felt weak, but she couldn't stop now. She needed help, someone who would understand, someone who wouldn't be part of whatever was happening here. Her mind went to Denny Wilkes, the shelter's janitor. She'd often noticed his gentle way with the animals, how he'd slip them extra treats and whisper softly to them during his rounds. She found him in the back corridor, methodically mopping the floor. His gray hair peeked out from under his worn baseball cap, and the ever-present smell of antiseptic and dog shampoo surrounded him. "Mr. Wilkes, could I have a moment?" Denny looked up, his eyes immediately going to the puppies in her arms. "Everything okay, Doc?" Miriam glanced around to ensure they were alone. "I need your help. These puppies, they have unusual scars, surgical ones. I've seen similar marks before in cases of illegal experimentation. But Carl wants them euthanized immediately. Something's not right." Denny's weathered face grew serious. He propped his mop against the wall and stepped closer, examining the scars with surprising expertise. His fingers traced the marks with practiced precision. "Well, I'll be damned," he whispered. "These are tracking tag scars. Seen them plenty in my old work." Miriam's heart skipped. "Your old work?" Denny nodded, his expression distant. "Used to be a wildlife forensic tagger, specialized in tracking patterns of abuse and illegal animal trafficking. These marks?" He pointed to the precise angle of the incisions. "That's a professional cut meant to insert untraceable chips. Saw it all the time in illegal operations." Relief and validation flooded through Miriam. "Then you understand why they can't be euthanized. They're evidence of something bigger. Evidence that someone sure doesn't want found, by the looks of it." Denny's voice was quiet but firm. "Listen, Doc, I've been watching this place for months now. Something ain't right with the euthanasia numbers, with how quick certain animals disappear. Been too scared to speak up. But maybe," he met her eyes, "maybe it's time someone did." Miriam felt the weight of discovery settling between them, a shared understanding of the darkness they might be facing and the risks of exposing it. But looking at Denny's resolute expression, she knew she'd found an ally, someone else who'd seen the patterns, who understood what they meant, and who was willing to help stop them. The puppies squirmed in her arms, their warm bodies a reminder of what was at stake. She wasn't alone anymore, and this time, the truth wouldn't be buried. That night, after most staff had left, Miriam and Denny crept through the shelter's dim hallways. Their footsteps echoed softly against the concrete floors, mixing with the occasional whimper from the kennels. Denny pulled out a ring of janitor's keys, his hands steady despite the risk they were taking. "Records rooms down here," he whispered, leading them past rows of empty offices. "Been cleaning it for years. Noticed things ain't adding up lately." The lock clicked open and they slipped inside. Miriam pulled out her flashlight, its beam cutting through the darkness to reveal tall filing cabinets and dusty shelves. The air smelled of old paper and secrets. "Look at this," Denny said, pulling out a drawer marked Intake Records 2023. "See how these numbers don't match?" Miriam leaned in close. The official intake form showed fewer animals than the daily count sheets. Way fewer. And the euthanasia records? Those numbers were impossibly high, even for their overcrowded shelter. "There's more," Denny muttered, reaching for a laptop on the desk. "Been keeping track of the chip numbers I've seen. Lots of duplicates, some that don't match any known manufacturer." Their discovery was interrupted by heavy breathing behind them. Carl Henders stood in the doorway, his face twisted with rage. "Breaking and entering!" he spat. "That's a criminal offense. I'm calling the police right now." Miriam's heart pounded, but she stood her ground. "Go ahead, Carl. Let's see what they make of these records. The missing animals, the fake chip numbers, it all points to trafficking." Carl's hand shook as he held up his phone. "You've got no proof, and no one will believe a washed-up vet and a janitor." "Maybe not," Miriam said, thinking fast. "But I know someone they will believe." After Carl stormed off, leaving them with threats of legal action, Miriam knew she had only one option left. She pulled out her phone and stared at a number she hadn't dialed in 3 years. Clayton picked up on the 4th ring. "Miriam." His voice was gruff, guarded. "It's been a while." "I need your help, Clay." The words felt strange in her mouth. Remember those animal control cases you worked? It's happening again. Here at my shelter." Silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken history. Finally, Clayton spoke. "Meet me at Riley's Diner. 1 hour." The diner was nearly empty when Miriam walked in. Clayton sat in a corner booth, still wearing the casual tactical gear he favored since leaving the force. A faint scar on his temple caught the fluorescent light, a reminder of what his last investigation had cost him. "You look tired," he said as she slid into the booth. "So do you." They sat in awkward silence until the waitress brought coffee. Miriam wrapped her hands around the warm mug, gathering courage. "I found evidence of trafficking," she began. "Surgical scars, doctored records, fake chip numbers. The shelter director's involved. Maybe others, too." Clayton's jaw tightened. "Like the Anderson County case." "Exactly like it." Miriam leaned forward. "You tried to expose them back then. Lost your badge for it." "Lost more than that," Clayton muttered, touching his scar. "Lost my sister's trust, too, if I remember right." The old pain flared between them. Miriam had blamed him for walking away, for letting the corruption win. She hadn't understood then what it had cost him. "I was wrong," she admitted softly. "About a lot of things. But I'm right about this, Clay. These animals are disappearing into the same kind of network you tried to stop. I need your help to do it, right this time." Clayton studied her face, his ex-cop's instincts still sharp. "You got proof?" Miriam pulled out her phone, showing him the photos and records. His expression darkened as he swiped through them. Same surgical technique, he noted. Same record patterns. Hell, might even be the same people. He looked up at her. "You know what you're getting into? These operations go deep. Last time you were alone," Miriam cut in. "This time you've got help." Clayton ran a hand over his face, considering. Finally, he nodded. "All right, but we do this smart. No heroics, no solo investigations. We build a solid case, bring in the right authorities at the right time." Relief flooded through Miriam. She reached across the table, touching her brother's hand. "Thank you." His fingers tightened briefly around hers. "Don't thank me yet. This is just the beginning." Clayton hunched over his laptop at Miriam's kitchen table, surrounded by stacks of printed records. 3 days had passed since their diner meeting, and dark circles under his eyes showed how little he'd slept. He clicked through public transport manifests, comparing them to the shelter's documentation Miriam had secretly copied. "Look at this pattern," he said, pointing to his screen. Miriam leaned over his shoulder, the smell of coffee strong on his breath. "Every Tuesday and Friday, like clockwork. The shelter reports these animals as euthanized, but transport logs show unmarked vans leaving the facility during off hours." Miriam's stomach tightened. "How many animals are we talking about?" "At least 30 each month, probably more." Clayton rubbed his temples. "And it's not just our shelter. I'm seeing similar patterns across 3 counties. The numbers, the timing, it's all too perfect to be coincidence." "A network," Miriam whispered. The word felt heavy in her mouth. "A big one." Clayton pulled up another document. "These transport companies, they're all registered to different owners, but dig deeper, and the paper trail leads back to shell corporations. Someone's gone to a lot of trouble to hide their tracks." Before Miriam could respond, her phone buzzed. Carl Hender's name flashed on the screen. She answered on speaker. "Doctor." "Lockhart." Carl's voice crackled, tight with barely controlled anger. "I'm giving you one last warning. Drop whatever you think you're investigating, or I'll make sure you never work in veterinary medicine again. I've got friends in high places." "Are you threatening me, Carl?" Miriam kept her voice steady despite her racing heart. "I'm trying to protect you," he snarled. "You have no idea what you're messing with." The line went dead. Clayton's face hardened. "We need to move faster. Carl's scared. Means we're getting close to something big." Just then, Miriam's phone lit up again. This time it was Denny. "You need to see this," the janitor's voice trembled with excitement. I followed one of those vans you mentioned. Got pictures." 20 minutes later, Denny spread his photos across Miriam's kitchen table. They showed a rundown building on the outskirts of town, with multiple vans parked outside. Through grimy windows, stacked cages were visible. "It's not registered as a kennel," Denny explained, his usual quiet demeanor charged with nervous energy. "But I saw them unloading animals, lots of them. And Miriam." He paused, swallowing hard. "I recognize some of those dogs from our shelter, ones that were supposed to be put down last week." Miriam sank into a chair, her mind racing back to the puppies with the surgical scars. They were never meant for adoption, she realized aloud. Their inventory, stock. Carl's been using the shelter as a front, processing animals through the system just to feed them into this network. "Not just Carl," Clayton interjected, studying the photos. "Look at the quality of these vans, the security set up around that building. This is professional, organized. Carl's just a middle manager. Someone with serious resources is running this operation." "But who?" Miriam asked. Clayton shook his head. "That's what worries me. Last time I investigated something like this, I hit a wall of political protection. Someone higher up was pulling strings, but I could never prove it. Got pushed out before I could connect the dots." Denny laid one final photo on the table, a close-up of a man in an expensive suit directing operations outside the warehouse. "Maybe this helps?" "He showed up while I was watching, seemed to be in charge." Clayton's face went pale. "I know him. He was involved in the Anderson County case, but we could never touch him. He's got connections in state government." Miriam stared at the image, feeling the magnitude of what they'd uncovered settling over her. The shelter wasn't just one corrupt facility. It was a cog in a much larger machine, processing animals through a network that reached far beyond their small town. "What do we do now?" Denny asked, his voice small. Clayton gathered the photos, his movements precise and determined. "We keep digging, build an airtight case, document everything, and most importantly, we watch our backs. These people know we're onto them, and they've got a lot to lose." Miriam nodded, thinking of the countless animals that had disappeared into this network. "Whatever it takes," she said firmly. "We shut this down." Miriam stared at the photograph on her computer screen, her hand trembling as she clicked through old news articles. Dr. Lionel Greaves' distinguished face smiled back at her from various charity events and veterinary conferences. The same face Denny had captured outside the warehouse. "I can't believe I didn't connect it sooner," she said, turning to Clayton and Denny in her living room. 5 years ago, Greaves ran this huge rescue transport program. It was all over the local news, moving animals from high-kill shelters to no-kill facilities in other states. Clayton leaned forward. "What happened to it?" "It just disappeared. No announcement, no explanation. The whole program vanished overnight." Miriam pulled up another article. "But now I'm wondering if it never really stopped. What if he just pushed it underground?" Denny cleared his throat. "I might know someone who can help. There's this clerk at the licensing board, Amy Chen. She helped me years ago when I was reporting wildlife trafficking. She's scared of Greaves, but she might talk." 2 days later, Clayton met Amy in a busy coffee shop. She handed over a thick manila envelope, her hands shaking. "I could lose everything for this," she whispered, "but what they're doing, it's wrong." The documents told a chilling story. Similar operations in 3 different states, all connected through a web of shell companies and falsified transport records. And at the center of it all, Dr. Lionel Greaves. "We need hard evidence," Clayton said, spreading the papers across Miriam's kitchen table. "Something that ties him directly to the trafficking." Miriam took a deep breath. "I know how to get it." The state veterinary office was housed in a sleek downtown building. Miriam smoothed her blazer, checking that the tiny recorder in her pocket was working. She'd emailed Dr. Greaves about transferring to a different facility, claiming the stress of her current position was too much. The elevator doors opened to a pristine reception area. Dr. Greaves stood waiting, impeccable in a charcoal suit, his silver hair perfectly styled. His smile was warm, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Dr. Lockhart, what a pleasure." He gestured toward his office. "Please come in." The office was massive, with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. Greaves settled behind an enormous desk, motioning for Miriam to sit. "I was intrigued by your email," he said, folding his hands. "You've had quite a challenging time lately, haven't you? All those questions about protocols, those concerns about missing records." Miriam forced herself to maintain eye contact. "It's been difficult. The euthanasia numbers seem unusually high, and some things just don't add up." "Numbers can be such tricky things," Greaves said smoothly. "Sometimes what looks like a problem is really an opportunity." He opened a drawer and pulled out a folder. "I have a proposition for you." He slid several glossy photos across the desk, a modern veterinary clinic with state-of-the-art equipment. "We're opening a new facility in Charleston. Private practice, no shelter work, no more difficult decisions about euthanasia. The position comes with a substantial salary increase, of course." Miriam's heart pounded. "And in return?" "Simply discretion." Greaves' smile tightened. "Your recent curiosity about shelter operations has caused some concern. I'm offering you a chance to move forward, to focus on more rewarding work. All you need to do is stop asking questions." "You're bribing me to look the other way," Miriam said quietly. Greaves leaned back, his facade cracking slightly. "I prefer to think of it as a mutually beneficial arrangement. The system works, Dr. Lockhart. It may not be pretty, but it's necessary. There will always be too many animals, too few homes. We simply manage the overflow through alternative channels." "Alternative channels?" Miriam's voice shook with anger. "You mean selling them to labs? Underground breeding operations?" "The details aren't important." Greaves waved his hand dismissively. "What matters is that you have a choice to make. Take the promotion, enjoy your new life, or keep pushing and find out just how difficult things can become." Miriam stood slowly. "I'll need time to think about it." "Don't take too long." Greaves' tone was light, but his eyes were cold. Opportunities like this tend to expire quickly. Outside, Miriam's hands trembled as she stopped the recorder. She had what they needed: Greaves' own words, his implied threats, the attempted bribe. Combined with Amy's documents and Denny's photos, they finally had enough to expose the whole operation. She pulled out her phone to text Clayton and Denny. "Got it. Meet at my place in 1 hour." Her finger hovered over the send button when a shadow fell across her screen. She looked up to find Carl Henders blocking her path, his face grim. "Dr. Lockhart," he said, "we need to talk." Miriam's hands shook as she uploaded the audio file to her laptop. The recording of Greaves' threats played clearly through her speakers, each word more damning than the last. Beside the audio file, she arranged the photographs from Denny and the documents from Amy Chen in a neat digital folder. "Are you sure about this?" Clayton asked, standing behind her chair. "Once we release this, there's no going back." Miriam nodded, thinking of those 2 trembling puppies that had started it all. People need to know. All of it. She attached the heart-wrenching photo of the hugging puppies to the top of her social media post. Below it, she detailed everything: the trafficking network, the falsified records, the corrupt officials, and finally, the damning recording of Dr. Greaves himself. With a deep breath, she clicked post. Within hours, the story exploded. Local news stations picked it up first, then national outlets. The image of the embracing puppies became a symbol that touched hearts across the country. Social media erupted with calls for justice, investigations, and reform. "It's working," Denny said, scrolling through his phone. "Look at these numbers. Hundreds of thousands of shares already." Miriam felt a wave of relief wash over her. After years of staying quiet, of following protocols she knew were wrong, she had finally spoken up. The truth was out there, and people were listening. But the victory was short-lived. 3 days after the story broke, Miriam climbed into her car for her morning drive to work. Her beloved German Shepherd, Lucky, jumped into the passenger seat as always. She pulled out of her driveway and headed down the winding country road that led to the shelter. The first sign something was wrong came when she pressed the brake pedal, approaching a sharp curve. The pedal went straight to the floor with no resistance. "No, no, no!" Miriam's heart lurched as she pumped the useless brake pedal. The car kept accelerating down the hill, heading straight for the guardrail. Lucky whined, sensing her panic. Miriam's veterinary training kicked in. Stay calm, think clearly. She remembered her father's voice from driving lessons years ago. If your brakes ever fail, gear down and use the emergency brake. With trembling hands, she shifted into a lower gear and slowly pulled up the emergency brake. The car shuddered violently. Trees and fence posts whipped past in a blur. Lucky pressed against her side, trembling. The car finally skidded to a stop mere feet from the guardrail, leaving long black marks on the asphalt. Miriam sat frozen, her knuckles white on the steering wheel, Lucky's warm breath on her cheek. A police officer who responded to her emergency call crawled under the car with a flashlight. His face was grim when he stood up. "This wasn't an accident, ma'am," he said, wiping his hands on his uniform. "Your brake line's been cleanly cut. Someone did this deliberately." Miriam felt the blood drain from her face. Lucky pressed closer, protective and alert. The message couldn't have been clearer. They wanted her to stop, and they were willing to kill to make that happen. That evening, Miriam sat in her living room, surrounded by messages of support from around the country. But she couldn't stop shaking. Lucky hadn't left her side all day, sensing her distress. "Maybe we should back off," Clayton suggested gently. "Let the authorities handle it from here." Miriam stared at her phone, at the thousands of comments from people demanding justice, at the photo of those two puppies that had started everything. Then she looked at Lucky, remembering how close they'd come to death that morning. Fear coursed through her veins. Was exposing this corruption worth her life? Worth Lucky's life? She thought of all the animals still trapped in the system, all the people who were counting on her to see this through. "I need time," she whispered, burying her face in Lucky's fur. "Just time to think." Clayton squeezed her shoulder. "Take all the time you need. But remember, you're not alone in this fight anymore." Miriam nodded, but her mind was racing. The brake line incident had made everything real, terrifyingly real. This wasn't just about exposing corruption anymore. It was about survival. As Lucky nuzzled her hand, she wondered how many more lives would be put at risk before this was over. For 3 days, Miriam barely left her house. She sat in her dimly lit living room, blinds drawn, jumping at every unexpected sound. Lucky stayed close, his warm presence her only comfort. Dishes piled up in the sink. Unopened messages filled her phone. The weight of fear and doubt pressed down on her like a heavy blanket. A gentle knock at the door made her flinch. Lucky's ears perked up, but he didn't bark. "Miriam," Denny's familiar voice called out. "It's just me." She hesitated, then shuffled to the door. Denny stood there, holding a paper bag that smelled like fresh coffee and pastries. "Thought you might need breakfast," he said with a gentle smile. "Mind if I come in?" Miriam stepped aside, letting him enter. They settled at her small kitchen table, where Denny laid out still warm muffins and poured coffee from a thermos. "Everyone's worried about you," he said softly. "Clayton especially." Miriam stared into her coffee cup. "I almost died, Denny. Lucky too. I keep thinking, what if I hadn't remembered about the emergency brake? What if—" "I know about fear," Denny interrupted quietly. "And about losing everything because you stood up to the wrong people." Something in his tone made Miriam look up. Denny's usual gentle expression had hardened with old pain. "I never told you why I left Wildlife Services," he said, his fingers tracing the rim of his cup. "I had a daughter, Sarah. She was 12 years old and crazy about animals, just like her old man." Miriam watched as Denny's eyes grew distant with memory. "I was tracking chemical dumping in waterways, big corporations cutting corners. Found evidence that could have shut them down. But before I could file the report, Sarah got sick. The same water I was testing. It ran right past her school playground. His voice cracked. The company's lawyers buried us in paperwork. By the time we got through the red tape, the cancer had spread too far. She was gone in 6 months. Lucky patted over and laid his head on Denny's knee. The old janitor scratched behind the dog's ears. I gave up after that. Took this job at the shelter because being around animals was the only thing that still made sense. But watching you fight back these past weeks, it reminded me of something Sarah used to say. Dad, the animals can't speak for themselves. That's why they need us. Miriam reached across the table and squeezed Denny's hand. Her own fears suddenly seemed smaller against the weight of his loss. The thing is, Denny continued, meeting her eyes, running away doesn't stop the bad things from happening. It just means they happen to someone else instead. Miriam thought of all the animals still moving through the trafficking network, of all the people who had shared their own stories after her post went viral. She straightened in her chair. You're right, she said. But we need something concrete, something they can't bury or explain away. Actually, Denny said, pulling out his phone, I've been watching the shelter's delivery patterns. They move animals every third Thursday, always at night. That's tomorrow, Miriam realized. She stood up and began pacing, her mind racing. Lucky followed her, his tags jingling. The sound gave her an idea. Lucky's GPS collar, she said suddenly. We could use it to track the next shipment, follow it right to their main facility. Denny nodded slowly. But we'd need help. Official help. Clayton, Miriam said, already reaching for her phone. He mentioned having contacts in federal law enforcement who might help if we had solid evidence. Within an hour, Clayton arrived with maps and surveillance equipment. The kitchen table became their command center as they crafted their plan. Lucky would wear a modified collar with a high-powered GPS tracker. They would plant him in the next shipment, following his signal to the trafficking hub. My contact at the FBI is ready to move, Clayton said, spreading out a map. But they need ironclad evidence, photos, locations, everything. We only get one shot at this. Miriam scratched Lucky behind the ears, feeling the familiar texture of his collar. Fear still fluttered in her chest, but it was different now, more like anticipation than dread. Tomorrow night, then, she said firmly, we finish this. Denny smiled, a flash of his old grief mixing with new determination. Sarah would have loved this part. Clayton reached over and squeezed his sister's shoulder. You sure about this? Miriam looked at her unlikely team. Her estranged brother who had risked everything for justice before, the gentle janitor carrying the weight of an unthinkable loss, and her loyal Lucky, ready to help as always. She thought of those first 2 puppies, clinging to each other in their cage, and all the others like them still waiting to be saved. I'm sure, she said. Let's get to work. The night air felt electric as Miriam held Lucky close, her heart pounding against his warm fur. The shelter parking lot was empty except for the white euthanasia van, its engine idling in the darkness. Carl stood by the open rear doors, clipboard in hand, looking impatient. Last chance to back out, Clayton whispered from the shadows, where he waited with their surveillance equipment. Miriam shook her head, adjusting Lucky's special collar one final time. The GPS tracker was carefully hidden beneath the regular tags. She pressed her face against Lucky's neck, breathing in his familiar scent. Be brave, boy, she whispered. Then, squaring her shoulders, she walked into the floodlit loading area. Surrender form's right here, Carl said gruffly, not meeting her eyes. Sign at the bottom. Miriam's hand trembled as she signed. Lucky went quietly into the van, turning once to look at her with trusting eyes. The doors slammed shut with a metallic clang that made her flinch. She waited until the van disappeared around the corner before running back to Clayton's car where he and Denny were hunched over a laptop, showing Lucky's GPS signal. Signal's strong, Clayton reported as they pulled onto the road, keeping a safe distance behind the van. He's moving northeast on Highway 47. The van led them through a maze of back roads deeper into the countryside. After 45 minutes, it turned onto a dirt track nearly hidden by overgrown brush. "Kill the headlights," Clayton instructed, easing the car forward in darkness. They crested a small hill and saw it, a sprawling warehouse complex, floodlights casting harsh shadows across its corrugated walls. 2 FBI vehicles were already in position, hidden in the tree line. Clayton's contact, Agent Torres, approached their car silently. "We've got eyes on all exits," she whispered. "Waiting for your confirmation before we move in." Miriam peered through binoculars at the loading dock where the van had stopped. Her breath caught as she watched them unloading cages. "That's them. Those are shelter tags on those crates." A familiar bark made her heart leap. Through the warehouse's side door, she glimpsed rows of stacked cages. And there, in one of them, a large brown shape she would know anywhere. "Bear," she gasped. "He's alive!" The German shepherd she'd thought was euthanized months ago was very much alive, his distinctive white chest patch visible even from this distance. Agent Torres spoke quietly into her radio. "All units prepare to move in. On my mark." Headlights suddenly swept across the compound as a black SUV emerged from behind the warehouse. Even at this distance, Miriam recognized Lionel Greaves behind the wheel. "He's running!" Clayton shouted. Without thinking, Miriam grabbed her car keys and sprinted to her vehicle. The engine roared to life as she slammed it into gear. She heard Clayton yelling after her, but there was only one way out of the compound, the main gate, and she knew what she had to do. Tires spitting gravel, she raced down the access road. Behind her, she heard the FBI raid beginning. Shouts, doors bursting open, the chaos of a coordinated takedown. But her focus was entirely on the gate ahead and the approaching SUV. She yanked the wheel hard, skidding sideways until her car completely blocked the exit. Through the windshield, she saw Lionel's face, illuminated by his headlights, first shocked, then contorted with rage as he realized who had trapped him. His SUV accelerated. Miriam gripped her steering wheel, her knuckles white. "Not this time," she whispered. "You're not hurting anyone else." At the last second, Lionel swerved, his SUV careening into the fence beside her. The impact was deafening. By the time he stumbled out of his crumpled vehicle, FBI agents had him surrounded. Miriam's legs were shaking as she got out of her car. Lucky's bark cut through the chaos, and suddenly he was there, leaping into her arms, his whole body wiggling with joy. Bear's deeper bark joined in from inside the warehouse, where agents were already documenting the hundreds of animals kept in deplorable conditions. She watched as agents led Lionel away in handcuffs, his perfectly tailored suit now covered in dust. He tried to catch her eye, but she turned away, focusing instead on the animals being rescued all around her. Clayton appeared at her side, looking both proud and exasperated. "That was either the bravest or the craziest thing I've ever seen." "Maybe both," Miriam said, scratching Lucky's ears as Bear was let out on a leash by a grinning Agent Torres. The German shepherd recognized her immediately, straining toward her with excited whines. Denny joined them, his eyes wet as he surveyed the ongoing rescue operation. "Sarah would have loved this," he said softly. "Justice, at last." Red and blue lights flashed across the warehouse walls as more police vehicles arrived. The night air filled with radio chatter, barking dogs, and the organized chaos of a major raid. Miriam watched from beside her car as FBI agents led a handcuffed Lionel Greaves toward a waiting vehicle. "Doctor, Miriam Lockhart?" A tall woman in an FBI windbreaker approached. "I'm Special Agent Roberts. We'll need your statement, but first, I want you to know, what you've done here is extraordinary. This operation goes deeper than anyone imagined." Inside the warehouse, evidence teams photographed hundreds of cages while veterinary technicians assessed the animals. The scope was staggering. Shipping manifests showed connections to illegal breeding operations in 3 states. Transport logs revealed how shelter animals marked for euthanasia had been diverted into underground pet trade networks. "We've got another one trying to run." someone shouted from the back of the building. Miriam turned to see Carl Henders, his button-down shirt dark with sweat, attempting to slip away through a side door. 2 agents caught him easily. The shelter director's face crumpled as they led him past Miriam. "I had no choice," he babbled, his earlier arrogance gone. "Lionel said he'd ruin me if I didn't cooperate. He had connections everywhere, the licensing board, state inspection teams, everyone." Clayton appeared at Miriam's side, his expression grim. "They'll want his full confession on record." He squeezed his sister's shoulder. "You were right all along. I should have believed you sooner." "You came through when it mattered," Miriam said softly, watching as Carl was placed in a patrol car. Inside the main warehouse, Denny worked alongside the evidence teams, his expertise in wildlife tagging proving invaluable. He carefully documented the modified microchips and helped match them to stolen animal records. "These are professional-grade tools," he explained to the agents. "Same ones I used to track endangered species. They've been altering legitimate shelter chips to create untraceable new identities for these animals." The night stretched on as more details emerged. Miriam gave her official statement, describing everything from the first suspicious scars she'd noticed to Lionel's attempted bribe. Agent Roberts nodded approvingly as she explained how they'd gathered evidence. "The district attorney is already calling this the largest animal trafficking bust in state history," the agent said. "Your documentation was crucial. The recording you made of Dr. Greaves alone is damning evidence." Near dawn, Miriam finally had a moment to check on the rescued animals. Bear and Lucky shared a temporary kennel, both dogs pressing against her hands as she knelt beside them. Around her, veterinary teams worked to assess and treat dozens of animals who'd been marked for death at various shelters. "Dr. Lockhart?" A young state investigator approached, looking slightly awestruck. "The press is starting to arrive. They're calling you a hero." Miriam shook her head. "I just did what any veterinarian should do. These animals needed someone to speak for them." Clayton joined her, his phone buzzing constantly. "My old captain called. They're reopening the cases I tried to expose 3 years ago. Said my dedication to uncovering the truth has been vindicated." He smiled wryly. "Funny how success changes their tune." Denny emerged from the evidence room, looking tired but satisfied. "The FBI wants me to consult on similar cases," he said quietly. "Said my experience with wildlife tracking could help identify other trafficking operations." His eyes grew distant. Sarah would have loved seeing all these animals saved. The sunrise painted the sky in soft pinks and golds as the last of Lionel's co-conspirators were led away. Miriam stood with Clayton and Denny, watching animal transport vehicles arrive to take the rescued pets to legitimate shelters and rescue organizations. "What happens now?" Denny asked. Agent Roberts approached with an answer. "Dr. Greaves and 8 others are facing federal charges. Mr. Henders has agreed to testify against the entire network in exchange for consideration in sentencing. Dr. Lockhart, you'll be formally cleared of any wrongdoing, and the State Veterinary Board wants to recognize your ethical stand." Miriam knelt to hug Bear and Lucky one last time before they would be transported to a secure facility until the case was closed. "We did it," she whispered against their fur. "You're safe now. You're all safe." Around her, the warehouse that had housed so much suffering was being transformed into a scene of justice and redemption. Every cage being documented, every animal being treated, represented a life saved and a small piece of hope restored. The morning light streamed through the warehouse doors as Miriam watched the rescued animals being carefully loaded into transport vehicles. Each one had a story. Each one had been worth fighting for. The system that had failed them was being dismantled, and in its place, something better could finally begin to grow. 3 weeks after the raid, autumn sunlight streamed through the newly installed windows of Hope's Harbor Animal Sanctuary. The former warehouse had been transformed. Fresh paint brightened the walls, and the stark metal cages had been replaced with comfortable kennels and play areas. The air no longer carried the heavy scent of fear and despair. Miriam stood in what used to be the loading dock, now converted into a welcoming intake area. The nonprofit's mission statement hung proudly on the wall. Every life matters. Every story counts. Below it sat a framed photo of two puppies hugging, the image that had started it all. Denny emerged from the medical wing, his usual janitor's uniform replaced with a polo shirt bearing the sanctuary's logo. "The state inspector just left," he said, smiling. "We passed with flying colors. Said she's never seen a facility quite like this." "We had good teachers," Miriam replied, thinking of all the things they'd learned about what not to do. "The animals showed us what they needed." The sound of a car pulling up outside drew their attention. Clayton's SUV parked near the entrance, his newly reissued private investigator's badge catching the sun as he stepped out. He'd been working tirelessly, using his restored credentials to help other shelters identify potential trafficking risks. "Got those background checks you wanted," he called out, waving a folder. All 5 potential staff members came back clean. And, he grinned, the fundraising total just hit $150,000. Miriam felt her throat tighten. The public support had been overwhelming. Once the story broke, donations poured in from across the country. Local businesses offered supplies, and volunteers lined up to help. Even some of her former critics in the veterinary community had reached out to make amends. A familiar bark echoed from the sanctuary's residential wing. Bear and Lucky, now healthy and sporting glossy coats, bounded into the intake area. The 2 dogs had become unofficial mascots, their story of survival touching hearts nationwide. Lucky's tracking collar was long gone, replaced with a bright blue bandana declaring him a sanctuary ambassador. "They know it's almost walk time," Denny chuckled, reaching down to scratch Bear's ears. The dog leaned into his touch. All traces of past trauma faded into memory. "Hard to believe these are the same scared pups from 2 months ago." Miriam watched as the dogs circled playfully, their tails wagging. They'd kept their habit of staying close to each other, but now it was from choice rather than fear. "They remind us every day why we're doing this," she said softly. The sanctuary's phone rang, their dedicated rescue hotline. Clayton answered it, his expression growing serious as he listened. "Got a situation at the county line," he reported after hanging up. "Local deputy found 2 puppies abandoned in a box. They're pretty shaken up." "I'll get the intake room ready," Denny said, already moving to prepare the medical supplies they kept on hand for emergencies. 20 minutes later, a police cruiser pulled up to the sanctuary. The deputy stepped out, carrying a cardboard box with air holes punched in the top. Through the holes came the unmistakable sound of whimpering. Miriam's heart clenched, remembering another day when trembling puppies had needed her. But this time was different. This time, she had more than just hope to offer them. The deputy set the box down gently in the intake room. "Found them by the highway," he explained. "No chips, no collars. Someone just left them there." Miriam knelt beside the box and carefully opened the top. Inside, 2 small shapes huddled together, one black, one brown, both watching her with wide, frightened eyes. They couldn't have been more than 8 weeks old. "Hello, little ones," she whispered, keeping her voice soft and gentle. "You're safe now." The words felt different this time. Before, they had been a desperate promise made in the face of seemingly impossible odds. Now, they were a statement of fact. These puppies wouldn't face euthanasia. They wouldn't be lost in a system that valued efficiency over compassion. They would have time to heal, to learn to trust, to find their perfect forever homes. Denny appeared with warm blankets and a heating pad. Clayton stood watch at the door, his presence protective rather than intimidating. Bear and Lucky peered curiously from the hallway, as if remembering their own arrival. Slowly, carefully, Miriam lifted the puppies from the box. They clung to each other, just as Bear and Lucky once had, but their trembling began to subside as they felt the warmth of the blankets and gentle hands. "Welcome to Hope's Harbor," Miriam told them, her voice steady and sure. "Your story starts here." The black puppy lifted its head slightly, nose twitching at the treats Denny offered. Its companion followed suit, tiny tail giving an experimental wag. Small steps, Miriam knew, but important ones. Every journey toward trust began this way. She thought about how much had changed. The old shelter, with its harsh lights and countdown clocks, felt like a distant nightmare. Here, natural light filled every room. Here, kennels had beds and toys. Here, every animal's story mattered. Clayton stepped forward, paperwork in hand. "I'll start their intake forms," he said, then paused. "You know, when you called me that night about Bear and Lucky, I thought you were crazy. Throwing away your career over a hunch about 2 shelter dogs?" He smiled. "I've never been so glad to be wrong." "We all were a little crazy," Denny added, watching as the puppies cautiously accepted his offerings. "Crazy enough to believe we could change things." Miriam stood, surveying the sanctuary that had risen from the ashes of corruption and despair. Through the windows, she could see volunteers working in the exercise yard. The medical wing hummed with activity as their staff veterinarian performed routine checkups. In the meet-and-greet room, a family was bonding with a senior dog they planned to adopt. The 2 new puppies had relaxed enough to explore their blanket nest, their fears already beginning to fade in the sanctuary's nurturing atmosphere. Soon, they would join the other rescued animals in the puppy wing, where they would learn that humans could be kind, that food would come regularly, that love was possible. Bear and Lucky watched from their spot in the hallway, living proof that hope could triumph over darkness. They were permanent residents now, their presence a daily reminder of why the sanctuary existed. Every scared animal that came through their doors would see these 2 confident, happy dogs and know that transformation was possible. "Let's get these little ones settled," Miriam said, gathering the blanket-wrapped puppies in her arms. As she carried them toward the puppy wing, their tiny bodies relaxed against her chest. They were safe. They were home. And this time, that meant everything. Thanks for watching. If any part of this story lingered with you, consider subscribing. I'll be here again tomorrow, sharing another tale that speaks to the soul.